At this time, I'd like to introduce Doug Midori, who will be presenting on measuring RPKI adoption with NetFlow. Doug is a director of internet analysis for Kentic, where he works on the internet infrastructure analysis. Prior to Kentic, he was the lead analyst for Oracle's Internet Intelligence team, formerly Dyn Research in Renesas. This is Doug's sixth time presenting at NANOG. Doug's first NANOG was in 2010 during a lightning session about accountability importing censorship. About accidentally importing censorship. Welcome back to NANOG, Doug. We are certainly glad to have you with us today.
All right, happy Valentine's Day, NANOG. So my name is, I'm sorry?
Happy Valentine's.
Yeah, to you too, thank you. So here's my Valentine to NANOG. So I'm Doug Midori, as Michael said. This is a talk that I put together with Joop Snijders out of Fastly, who isn't with us today, but he's over in the Netherlands and hopefully listening in. I believe he may be in the chat if there are any questions. So this is our talk measuring RPKI ROV adoption with NetFlow. So to get us started, so where are we with RPKI ROV adoption? So RPKI still stands as the internet's best defense against BGP hijacks stemming from routing, from typos, BGP mishaps, other types of routing mistakes, origination leaks. But with like any broad security or distributed security mechanism, it requires many individual actions in order to adopt and to deploy this internet-wide functionality. And to get at the outset of something like this, you have a chicken or the egg problem of why would anybody bother rejecting any invalids if there are no, if no one's signing routes, there are no ROAs, and why bother creating any ROAs if there's no, if nobody's rejecting invalids? We're going to revisit that question because in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of progress made here. So this is so we have two sides of this, of what makes RPKI work. You have the dropping of invalids, and nowadays you've got many tier one ISPs that have come out in the last few years that are dropping invalids. We have Lumen, Aurelion, some other tier ones that have yet to rebrand into some fun new name. And then according to, this is a screenshot from the NIST RPKI Monitor. It's a website put on by NIST that tracks ROA creation, has a lot of different dimensions that they study ROA creation. A lot of it's temporal, so you can see what's happening over time. The links at the bottom, but the thing I'm trying to highlight here is that, you know, as of a couple of years ago, we started to see an inflection point, and things started to change where the yellow is how many BGP routes are in the global routing table that are without a ROA. So they are, as far as RPKI is concerned, unknown. And the green line is those that have a ROA and are presently routed in would be evaluated as valid by RPKI. And thirdly, there's a red line. It's hard to see because it's just hugging the x-axis, and those are those routes that are persistently invalid, and it's a very, very small number. But the point being is that as of a couple of years ago, we started to see a lot of movement, and this is just by counting routes from BGP. So as I mentioned, there's kind of two steps to filtering an invalid route, which is the objective. You've got to have people creating the ROAs in step one, and you got to have people dropping the invalids in step two. Over in step one, as far as evaluation of progress, we've got a couple of resources. I mentioned the NIST page, which is pretty neat. RIPEStat tool has incorporated a new little widget that provides RPKI status by country. There's a bunch of different ways that you can look at it. It has V6, V4, percentage, absolute numbers. On the other side, then it's an active area of research, and arguably it's a harder thing to try to assess globally what are the networks that are dropping invalids, and there's a lot of different projects that go along. They're trying to study that. This talk is focused a little more on the left-hand side, something that maybe we thought this was a solved problem, but I've got some new data that I'd like to share that I think puts a new perspective on where we stand here. So back to where we are, back to ROA creation. So going back to the NIST stats, this is a graphic I pulled a few days ago off the NIST RPKI Monitor, and we're looking at this is V4, the big graph is V4 routes. How many are valid versus not found or unknown? Right now, it's reporting 34.1% of V4 BGP routes presently signed and valid. If you were to pull up V6, it's going to be about 32.6. Either way, it's about a third, and so it's about 2 to 1 unknowns to valids, and that's those are the two main categories, because the other either invalid or we'll see invalid but covering, those are very, very small categories. So it's a fight between unknown and valid, and it's 2 to 1. But the question is, how much traffic is safeguarded by that 34% or 32 for V6? That's the question I'm interested in. And before we get into that, let me take a quick little detour to something 3 years ago, a lifetime ago, an eternity ago, prior to the pandemic, way back in 2019. My co-presenter, Job Schneiders and Paolo Lucente, while Job was at NTT, they worked together to extend the capability of the PMA CCT network analytics tool to include a functionality to incorporate RPKI evaluation into the NetFlow. And the chief objective here was to try to put to rest the concern that dropping invalids was going to disrupt important customer traffic, or at least allow a user to investigate this to determine on their own. Without going ahead and starting to drop stuff, you could see what would be the impact before you do it. And this was helpful for a lot of companies who were on the fence to go ahead and embrace this technology. But at the end of his, he put in a long note to Nanog describing the work that they did. Everybody can benefit from this, and then put out a challenge to the chief NetFlow analytics platforms that they ought to adopt this this feature, because it could serve the public in a big way. So the challenge was extended, Kentic accepted, and in 2020, we incorporated this into our network analytics platform, and it's a pretty cool feature. In fact, a lot of this talk is going to be about stemming from our implementation of that feature. I don't know about the other company, but it's been part of the Kentic platform for a couple of years. So if we go one more month ahead, in March 2019, we're still in the ancient past of a couple of years ago. Job gave a talk at DKNOG in 9, looking at having built this tool, the PMA CCT tool with Paolo, and now they were looking at NTT Traffic, a pretty big network, and trying to assess what does it look like from NTT standpoint. This was a graph out of that presentation, and keep this in mind because we're going to see some of these a newer version of this kind of thing. But as you can see, I don't have the percentages here, but the vast majority is unknown. Again, we're before that inflection point on the NIST graphic that I mentioned earlier. And if I had to guess, generously, maybe that's 20% of valid traffic. This is by bits per second. And we've come a long way since then. As an aside, another point that Job made was, had this slide. It was a bit of a provocative title. Maybe not everybody needs to do RPKI. He's probably the world's chief proponent of this, but his argument was, due to the consolidation and centralization of the internet, if we only were able to get some major content providers and major access networks, eyeball networks, maybe some DNS service providers to implement RPKI, drop invalid, sign routes, we would have protected a lot of the internet traffic, and maybe we never get out to the extremities. So keep that in mind, because we're going to see how this ended up playing out. All right, so why does Kentic have any perspective to add to this story? So Kentic's got, I'm not sure what the current count is, over 300 customers. Avi can give us an update what the number should be. You have about half of those have allowed us to use some of the flow data that they provide us as part of aggregate analysis. And so if you follow me on Twitter or see some of the stuff I put in the media, when we're writing up a blog about a military junta in Myanmar, and we're publishing a traffic traffic falling off a cliff, or Tonga last month, we put something out with Reuters looking at the effects of the volcano and then the restoration. That's coming from this aggregate NetFlow analysis. That's where that comes from. It's important to note also, just from a scientific standpoint, that there are biases in this data. We have a variety of types of customers, of large NSPs, CDNs, digital businesses, but we do have a skew towards the US. So, despite those biases, notwithstanding, I think the analysis still holds up, that there's a lot that we can learn from this. So, back to the feature that Kentic put together of doing RPKI evaluation upon intake of NetFlow. And again, this originally was built so we could, for our customers, help them get off the fence about what would be the impact of dropping invalids. But what's really cool for an analyst like me is that I can now use this functionality to explore all kinds of things like we're going to see in a minute. All right, so what are the four cases that we're tracking as far as RPKI outcome? We're we're signing flows, one of these four states. This is essentially the same states that Job and Paolo have put into the PMA CCT tool. And so what's happening is if it's a flow to a destination IP, that IP has got a BGP route. If that route is valid, unknown, invalid, those are the options that it's assigned. There's also this possibility of it was to a route that was invalid. However, there was a covering prefix that was either valid or unknown. You wouldn't have dropped that had you been dropping invalids, and so therefore you potentially could have delivered it. It was important to Job that I emphasize that state number 4 is not part of any IETF or BGP spec. This exists solely in the analysis plane. And on the right is an example of what this would look like. So you've got a /24 that's RPKI invalid. You can see this is out of Hurricane Electric's handy bgp.at.net website. The little red key says that /24 is invalid, would have been dropped had you been rejecting invalids. But at least routing would have taken your packets onto the destination with that covering prefix that was valid with the green key, /17. All right. So we've established that about a third of the BGP routes, either V4 or V6, have got valid ROAs. How much traffic is that? All right, so I took a period of analysis. I've run this many times, but I settled on this 7 days ago just to pick a period of time, and then here are the main observations. We saw about less than 1% that's invalid but covering, so this is kind of inconsequential. If you were dropping invalids, the traffic would have been delivered anyway due to a covering prefix. 42% unknown, and 56.4% valid. And so I'm going to use the term, if you'll permit me, valid traffic. That's flows going to a route that would have been evaluated as RPKI valid. We're seeing the majority of traffic globally, we pool it all up, traffic going to any destination is going to a valid route. That is a big difference from what Job was presenting 3 years ago. And then we've got a tiny amount that's invalid. Again, not a reason to not drop invalids. All right, so I mentioned this RipeStat widget with the RPKI functionality. And we're going to use that to take a tour all around the world of what does this look like with country level stats. I mean, why don't we start, we're here in the US, we'll look at the US. So if we looked at V4, V6 based on the RipeStat tool, I think it would look the same if you were to pull this up right now. We're at 20%, a distinct minority of the routes. The way RipeStat does it, it's not counting BGP routes, it's doing IP address space. That's fine, I don't have any problem with that. What we're seeing in NetFlow is 58.5% of, this is in bits per second from NetFlow, combined V4, V6. It's a big difference. It's a lot more, And so why? Why is that? Well, good thing I've got an analytics platform to dig into this, because what ends up happening is we're seeing the outcome of these major RPKI deployments. On the eyeball network side, Spectrum, Charter, and Comcast are some of the biggest eyeball networks in the US we see traffic to. In fact, if you stick around in 2 talks, Tony Tauber from Comcast is going to tell the story of Comcast's RPKI deployment, which is going to be pretty cool. But we're seeing like almost all traffic to these major networks in the US as valid traffic going to a route that's RPKI valid. On the flip side of that, content providers, Google and Amazon, we're seeing 100%, and they push a ton of traffic. Cloudflare also very high, not quite 100%, but these networks, both these eyeball and content networks, may not account for a majority of BGP routes, but they do account for a lot of traffic. It's not 58.8, it's 58.5%, but it's pushing a lot. It's pushing that number up out of those smaller percentages for V4 and V6 space. So I won't ask you to read this thing, but we went and looked at what's the top 20 or so countries, and how do these stats work for other countries? And so if we take a little tour around the world, the numbers are all over the map, as the countries are. So we went through the US. These are the numbers we just saw a moment ago. Canada, Brazil, they both look, so in these colors here, the blue is the bits per second coming from NetFlow combined V4, V6. Again, we saw 58% in bits per second. Majority of traffic destined to the United States is now going to routes with valid ROAs. Orange is V4, gray is V6. Mexico is one of those few countries that goes actually in the other direction, that there's maybe more routes than we see traffic for. Again, potentially could be a bias of ours, but if we look at Europe, we have a lot of countries here, with Turkey as one of the top countries that have done major RPKI deployments. And most of these stats kind of track with each other. So we see most of the V4 space covered in Turkey, and most of the traffic going there is valid traffic. Maybe the biggest difference in this set in Europe is probably the UK. Listed as GB here, we're seeing V4 percentages at like 30-something%, and then the percent of traffic to the UK at 56.1%. Again, the NetFlow looks a lot better than the IP address space. If we go over to Asia plus Australia, we have wide extremes here. So Taiwan and the Philippines have got massive RPKI deployments. That's evident in either metric. And on the other side of the spectrum, you've got China and South Korea. Again, both have like almost none by any metric. Hopefully one day we can address that. So there's a lot of, if you have NetFlow to play with, there's other dimensions you can kind of explore. And I'll just go through these because they're kind of interesting. So one of those is that we typically by default merge our V4, V6 traffic together, but you can always pull that back apart. And we're seeing a much higher percent of valid traffic to valid routes in bits per second for V6 than V4. I've got some theories on that. If you've got some, step up to the mic at the end of this talk and let me hear them. Because these are some interesting observations in my mind. If you go by port, we see very high valid traffic stats for port 443. I think that probably comes back to those content providers deploying RPKI, and now they're pushing up port 80. But we can go a lot of dimensions here. One of the things that I noticed in playing around with the the RIPE-stat widget is that they've got a neat thing. Another, like the NIST website, it's got a temporal dimension, so you can see what was some dimension changes over time. And so this is an example from Poland. I don't remember what carrier it was, but they at the end of September had a big RPKI deployment. And if we look at V6 by percentage, they were covered going from 39% of IP address space covered to 64%. Well, when we pull up our data, I can see the same, a similar movement. It's not exactly one-to-one, but the movements are correlated. And so we're going from 46% to 60% in bits per second. Again, combined V6, V4. Another thing that maybe is an important study or event to be aware of is that there was a Taiwan NIC outage in September. It was such an outage that for a brief period of time, no one on Earth was able to evaluate an RPKI routes from Taiwan. And there's always a lot of concern and hand-wringing around this kind of scenario of would this cause an outage. The technology's been built to fail open, but be that as it may, there's still lingering concerns. So here's a case of an outage, of RPKI outage, and from our standpoint, when I dug into this, I could find no disruption to traffic. And our system was just dutifully, as the caches, the caches timed out, we reclassified all the traffic volume from valid to unknown, and then when it came back on, from unknown back to valid. And like nothing ever happened. You can see there's a diurnal pattern there of traffic going into Taiwan, and it was a non-event as far as traffic goes, and that's a good sign. Other kind of weird phenomenon, if you keep playing with it, you can keep finding more stuff. These routes in the course of a day don't change that much, but these percentages still change a little bit. There's a little undulation going throughout the day. We see a high around 2000 UTC, 57% valid traffic down to 0200 at 54, and this kind of shifts every day. I've got these marked out with little arrows. And this has more to do with user behavior. Obviously, the networking infrastructure stays the same for the most part during the day. And I mentioned those massive deployments for Comcast, Charter Spectrum, that are big sources of fixed line connectivity. But in the mobile space in the United States, we still have a long way to go. There's some deployments in AT&T, Verizon, not so much. And so when users are switching from their fixed line devices to the phones primarily, and they're going back and forth, it's shifting the volume of traffic of what's going to either valid or unknown. Again, the two main states that we see in RPKI. All right, so here are our best practices put together mostly from Job. So do sign routes. There are major carriers that are filtering, and that's going to protect your routes. Do reject RPKI invalids, and by doing this, you are likely, if this analysis holds up, and it's similar to what your network is experiencing, it's going to protect a majority of your outbound traffic against BGP hijacks due to typos, other mishaps like origination leaks. Again, we feel this is not a risk to legitimate traffic, but don't take my word for it. You've got the PMA CCT tool where you can run an evaluation on your own. And you can also do a trial with Kentic, pipe your flow in, and go in and do your own analysis. So you don't need to take my word for it. You can study this very easily on your own. On the do nots, it's highly discouraged to be modifying either local pref or BGP communities based on validation states. And here's why. So last year, there were a couple of vulnerabilities that surfaced around validators. In it, you could send some bad information into a validator, causing it to crash. That's been addressed and fixed, but the downstream impact is that if you had a very large network that was changing communities, or maybe less so of an effect of changing local pref based on validation states, and you're sharing this out to the internet, maybe it's okay if you keep it within your network, but if this is going out to the internet, this is going to cause all your routers to, everything that's valid is going to have to re-announce that route with a new state. Now it's unknown because it lost all its ability to access to see a validator. That has the potential to create a ton of messages at one time, and it could be disruptive, at least causing some instabilities. Job's got a reject invalids guide if you have any questions. And like I said, if you have any questions about RPKI or this analysis, reach out to the BGP A team. That's Job's moniker. The team consists of me, Job, and Job's cat. I have a cat too. He didn't make the team. All right. Anybody have any questions?
We have two online.
Okay.
Since Jeff was the first one to post, I'll go to him first. Jeff Houston says, let me rephrase the question, sorry. Is the flow data looking at traffic? So SDERVs to the clients, it looks like the server to the client data, and the issue is that it seems to be more critical to be protecting the route servers, not the client's routes. Comments, Doug.
The route.
Yeah.
The route servers. No. Sorry, where is it?
Right here.
Traffic to S. SD, servers to clients. I mean, this is traffic egressing the flow from the customer. So it can either be going. I mean, we've got access layer networks as well as content providers. So I guess it's just destination flow. So I don't know if I. All right, sorry.
The next question or comment comes from Randy Bush. A valid /17 trumps an invalid /24, and the announcement is in the 24.
Yeah, so that was the slide about if you were to drop an invalid. So in that, I gave that example of a /24.
That's the case 4.
Yeah, case 4. That's not in the spec, Job, of anything. So if you were to drop that 24, do you still have a route to deliver the IP if there's still a 17 that's a covering? Then yes, I don't understand what's controversial about that one. You know, while you're digging up another question, I think a question of I might ask myself, or it came up. I gave a little presentation of this, a little preview to the NIST team that does their Doug Montgomery and his team, and a point he made was that we're emphasizing. There's a conceit here that a route is more important that if it's got more traffic, and that's not always the case. There are some routes that are very important that don't. Maybe they don't have no traffic, but they don't have, it's not a ton of traffic. The example would be a traffic queries going to like a DNS authoritative server. And so we've seen cases where there's hijacks that deliberately go after the Route 53 hijack, go after authoritative servers. And so they are, the DNS world is very important, but maybe not as traffic intensive as something like video. So that's a valid critique.
Got one more question from Tony Lee. If an invalid more specific causes disruption, would that be an attack vector?
Let's see, if an invalid more specific causes disruption, I guess the idea is if it was an invalid, you would be dropping it. Causes more disruption would be an attack vector. I don't know if I quite understand that one. I don't know. Avi, do you have a?
Well, just as a reminder to people just learning RPKI, this is origin validation, not path validation.
That's true.
So if you could originate as whoever is actually signing it, and the path is, I'm not actually that AS, I'm just taking that AS in vain, then that would be an attack vector. But yeah, I think in general, in theory, that's the point, is that it would be dropped. Because it isn't validated. If you're using RPKI, if you're validating RPKI.
Right, and so
if you want it to be evil, I could take your AS in vain, and then origin validation doesn't necessarily.
So this is why there's a lot of thought gone into some of the word choices of I think in this space we call it the determined adversary, the scenario that obviously like could you with some sophistication defeat the mechanism as stands, and the answer is yes. So right now we're just trying to, this is where we're at with routing security. We're trying to just reduce or eliminate the bonehead mistakes, the fat fingers, the screw ups, because we've got plenty of those, and then we're going to move up the stack as we go. But
we have one more from Bruno. I'm not even go for the last name on that.
Texera.
Oh, thank you.
I think
there are still lots of SPs, at least in my country, who believe that RPSL IRR requirements for a better internet is optional. Do you think RPKI will be all around one day?
I think so. I mean, I think so. Better than so. Yeah, the world before RPKI is a lot of different homegrown, hacked together methods of filtering that have kind of served its purpose, but we've got better stuff coming down the line, and I think the at least the data that we're seeing here, things are moving in the direction of adoption. And I guess my main point is now we have a majority of traffic. Again, if this analysis holds up, this is what we're seeing as far as we have a lot of traffic that's now at least signed. So now we just need the rest of y'all to drop the invalids to complete the circle.
We got 40 seconds left. I got one more here from Aaron.
Aaron Weintraub.
Yep, thank you. Is there any research being done during RPKI outages to see if people are taking advantage of these outages?
That's a good question. I've tried to do that. There's been a couple of RPKI outages in the past. When I was at Oracle, there was an Afrinic outage. I remember digging in trying to see like, kind of maybe the answer to this was anybody taking advantage of this? The only thing I could find was, as far as like impact in the global routing table, is you've got a bunch of routes that were invalid that are now going to be unknown, and those had much lower propagation rates. And as soon as you have no way to evaluate them, all of a sudden they're globally routed. When the system comes back up, they go boop, they go back. That was the only. It's really hard to find. To be certain to find a hijack, a lot of these hijacks require some a priori or out-of-band information to know the context. Like this one that just happened in South Korea, if I were to stumble upon that, I wouldn't know that just strictly from the routing to know that this was a very sophisticated hijack. You need some out-of-band information, so it's easier said than done to find those kind of incidents. It may have happened.
Well, thank you, Doug.
All right, thanks a lot.
Round of applause for Doug.